IVM.
Vibrant global cities are about more than just great roads, great public transport, and good public services. The best of cities are cosmopolitan, inclusive, and plural. They become a vehicle for the dreams and aspirations for a critical mass of humanity. And for people to live, work, and flourish alongside each other in one city, you don't just need great physical infrastructure and jobs, but also great social infrastructure. Public spaces of all kinds that can enable conversations, art, and culture, these can make a city rich. They can enable a life of quality for its citizens. Ravichandar returns to the Pragati Podcast to tell us more about public spaces and social infrastructure and how we can create more of them in our cities. Welcome to the Pragati Podcast, a weekly talk show on public policy, economics, and international relations. We take a step back from noisy political debates and dive into rich conversations on India and the world. I am your host, Pavan Srinath. We'll start this episode's conversation after a short break.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another amazing week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you're not following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. So another really fun week on the network. I don't know if you saw this, but Varun Thakur was on Advertising is Dead. That was a really, really fun episode. Besides that, we've had some great guests all over the place. We had Ram Madhvani on Cyrus Says. We had Saurabh Mukherjee, a legend in the finance space. He was on Paisa Vaisa. He and Anupam co-written a book, so definitely do check out that episode and go buy their book too. I mean, that would be another great thing to do. Uncle Pleasted had a really, really cool episode with hosts of our other show, Mr. and Mrs. Binge-Watch, Anirudh and Janice. They were talking about celebrity culture and how that's progressed for the last few years. And yeah, it's just been a really, really great week. One episode I do want to shout out. A couple of weeks ago, Pulyabazi did an episode which was just amazing. They were talking about the letters between Mahatma Gandhi and Rabindranath Tagore. Do check those out. Those were really good. But with that, let me get you back to your show.
Welcome back to the Pragati Podcast. I'm your host, Pavan Srinath. Joining me today is Ravichandar, Honorary Director of the Bangalore International Centre and Chairman Feedback Consulting. He has been actively involved with urban reforms since being a part of the Bangalore Agenda Task Force in the year 2000. Most recently, he was a member of a government expert committee tasked with reimagining governance and administration for Bengaluru. He was here last in episode 95 of the Pragati Podcast to talk about the challenges and modalities of working with governments. Today, we will be going beyond his work with governments, but instead his work on public spaces and social infrastructure. And dear listener, like with the last several episodes, this episode too contains in-audio links, references, images, polls, and more. Listen to the episode on the IVM Podcast Android app, the Adori iOS app, or on your browser from the link tiny.cc/pragati149 for the full, rich experience. And a disclaimer before we get started, along with hosting the Pragati Podcast and the Teleharte Kannada Podcast and the IVM Podcast Network, I've also been working with Ravichandar at the Bangalore International Centre since March this year on the BIC Talks podcast. Hi Ravi, and welcome back to the Pragati Podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here on the show again.
Thanks, Pavan, for having me.
So Ravi, you've been here on the show in the past to talk about your experience working with government in various capacities, inside, outside, and in collaboration. In the past, you've spoken to my friend Amit Verma on the Seen and the Unseen about urban thinking and the challenges of Indian cities. Today, I want to focus on one particular aspect, which is that I think often when we think about our cities and its challenges, we think about hard infrastructure, roads, and other things. But is that thinking anemic? What makes a city a vibrant city in India or anywhere else in the world?
There is a tendency to think quality of life in a city refers to what you mentioned as the hard infrastructure, which is issues like traffic and garbage management and the like. But in reality, a city has elements of what I call the hard infrastructure and the soft infrastructure. A city comes alive in its public spaces, in its spaces for playing, in spaces for conversation, arts and culture. So if we are really going to talk in terms of what makes a great city, we will have to pay as much attention to the soft infrastructure as we do to the hard infrastructure.
So Ravi, I want to jump into this because you're not just an urban thinker, but somebody who is a doer and, aims on getting things done. You're currently the Honorary Director of the Bangalore International Centre. You've been involved with the creation of the Bangalore Literature Festival. So I want to ask, how did you get started with all this? I know that your journey within the urban space, or the urban reform space, has been longer, right? Perhaps spanning almost 2 decades now.
That's right.
When did you start thinking about these aspects and get your hands dirty with them as well?
I should think that while my involvement in what I earlier called the hard infrastructure is around 2 decades, my involvement with this whole space of public spaces is around a decade. So I used to be involved with the Bangalore Literature Festival. We have had 8 editions of the festival. And my aha moment in this space actually came that when we were trying to create a festival which was free for Bangaloreans to attend, there was no suitable space in which one could do it, or a public space in that sense.
Right.
And secondly, we had to go to a private space, which in this case, hotels. And we had to go to hotels, a private space, to create what is essentially a free-to-attend public event. And that's when I realized that we've got some of our basic priorities wrong, that we are not thinking about how do we create inclusive spaces for arts and culture to flourish. So to me, that really was a moment, I think it would be sometime around 2010. And post that, over the last decade, be it the Bangalore Literature Festival or the Bangalore International Centre, or even mentoring some other organizations in the arts and culture space, I find that I'm devoting more time to this aspect of city life than my earlier avatar, which was more focused on the hard infrastructure.
Today in most of our cities, if we come back home from work, and I'm perhaps talking pre-pandemic and lockdown and all of that, if we wanted to go do something, the most natural option for those of us with some privilege and some money would be to go to a mall, hang out there, go watch a movie, grab dinner. There is very little else that one can do in an Indian city right now, right? And that's a major, major problem.
That's right. In fact, just as a data point, if I take the city of Bangalore, they have a definition called open spaces in the master plan.
Okay.
When the 1995 master plan was put out, which was really an 85 plan for 1995, the open spaces percentage was 25%.
Okay.
And recently they have put out the open spaces for the 2031 plan that has shrunk to 4% from 25%. So if you really want a data point of the shrinking open spaces, you have it in these 2 data points for Bangalore city, and I'm sure the situation in many other cities are similar. You mentioned malls. Now, you're right. In fact, most people think that going out to a mall, in a sense, is the space as a public outing. But a mall is far from what one has in mind as the public space, because the mall is more a place for the privilege for people with money to shop, to see a movie and the like. But when we are talking about public spaces, we are talking about spaces where any member of the public can actually partake in activities which cover the gamut of performing arts, visual arts and the like. And that definitely has to be far more than a mall. And yes, it's unfortunate that the malls have become the so-called new semi-public spaces.
It's perfectly legitimate for malls to be one of 20 things that people have access to, right? I mean, in that sense, it's all right. But
Yes.
The fact that it's the only one is the problem. And just like you mentioned how, we had so much more open space in Bangalore even a while ago, I have a hunch that maybe even though the data may not be available to give us as much clarity, I'm just thinking on a per person basis, perhaps even public institutions where people could go access concerts, could go access conversations and so on, were perhaps more in Bangalore 40, 50 years ago than today, right? I'm thinking, Bangalore, you had D.V. Gundappa, who started the Gokhale Institute of Public Affairs. You had societies like the Mythic Society. I think post the formation of the state, you had the building of structures like Ravindra Kalakshetra. So perhaps on a per person basis, we had more of such amenities, and perhaps because Bangalore was still a small city and traffic was not there, people could go access much of it. And today it seems to be worse, right? The number of people in the city are increasing at a much rapid rate, but our amenities from physical infrastructure to social infrastructure are just not able to keep up.
That is right. Actually, we had a lot more of them. And I mean, over time, I would say that while we have tried to keep pace through some private people coming into the space, you're right. In fact, the Institute of World Culture also was another thing that has been around in Bangalore for a long time. And similarly, Bangalore has also been known for some of its open-air concerts, the Ram Seva Mandali, the music concerts of that period, etc. Some of those institutions still continue to this date, but relative to what we should have in the city, there's a dearth of such spaces. I mean, there have been initiatives, just talking about Bangalore as a placeholder, there have been initiatives like Arundhati Nag creating Rangashankara about 15 years ago, or Jagriti Theatre near Whitefield, etc. But they are few and far between. And even a city like Bangalore, if you think of, okay, I need a large hall, beyond Chaudhaya, people are not able to think of another place that potentially serves that purpose. And Chaudhaya has been there for a very long time.
Right. And so that's the thing. I mean, we're growing so rapidly, but if we can still uh, count the new places, new public spaces on 2 hands or 3 hands, then we are in big trouble, right? So, unlike physical infrastructure, isn't this something that squarely lies in the domain of the society and the citizenry? So you've been toiling away at various causes, like pushing through better road design, pushing through property tax reforms and other things. But isn't this something that we have to take a lead on and not the government?
Yes and no. Clearly, the private sector, philanthropists, etc., definitely have a big role to play. I mean, if the Maharajas of old were the patrons of arts and culture, the new Maharaja are the business elite and the entrepreneurs and people who have done well in today's society. So there is definitely a certain responsibility for them to encourage such public institutions. But I wouldn't let the government off the hook. The government has a major role in terms of enabling such institutions to come up and thrive. They have an enabler role. And I don't think they can abdicate their role that they have nothing to do. So really, it's a mix of both. But if we see the last, one has observed this sector for a decade, whether you see it in Bangalore or in other cities, the activity in this space is predominantly driven by private individuals and institutions and foundations and the like to a greater extent. Now, if government can enable this to scale up even more rapidly, that would be very helpful.
So Ravi, then could you paint a picture for us, lay out the landscape? Because at one end you have things like Broadway and musical theater that might only be possible at that scale in maybe London and New York, right? But what all do you think can be possible in a city like Bangalore? And then we'll spend a little more time on government and private roles and funding and all of that.
So if you actually look at this, I call this space as a space for informed conversations, discussions, arts and culture. If we broadly take this as the gamut of the areas that we wish to cover, when you look at the arts and culture, you can look at it in terms of performing arts and visual arts. And within performing arts, you have music, theater, dance, which require physical spaces, stages. It could be indoor and outdoor, but often indoor works a lot better because of the kind of sound and quality that you require. And then you have in the area of visual arts, you have the galleries, the museums, even the film screening kind of halls, etc., would really come under visual arts. And then you need these rooms, if I can call it, or spaces where you can have these conversations and debates, whether it be on public policy or science or whatever, humanities and the like.
Right.
Now you need these kind of spaces. So really they are multi-purpose. Now if you look at the landscape of how these are structured institutionally, you will see that the bulk, I would say almost 80-85% of them are really private initiative led. So you will typically find either it is supported by a set of corporates or foundations or certain high net worth individuals who contribute to make such spaces possible. Now, the lead in creating such a space, it could be taken by an individual. Arundhati Nag is an example of a person from the industry who made it her passion to create Rang Shankara. So you had somebody from the creative arts space who went around, collected money from philanthropists and institutions and made such a space possible. At the other end of the spectrum, you have institutional setup. For example, Bangalore International Centre, of which I'm a part of, has been around for 15, 16 years. It's an institutional setup, which then decided that let's have a space for doing such things. And then again shopped around with donors. So whether it be private individuals or corporates or foundations, raised the money to make such spaces available. So you find different kinds of initiatives in the marketplace, Pavan.
So here then, would the government role in a big way in our cities be allocation of space? Because like you said, the public spaces vanished from 25% to 4%. And, parks, playgrounds, sports facilities are a little beyond the scope of our conversation today, but they're also a vital parallel infrastructure that need allocation from public and private. So here, do you see government's enabling role as being able to allocate land and real estate or permissions, or where do you see that?
So coming to government, clearly the land point that you mentioned, Pavan, is very important. For instance, again, coming back to Bangalore as an example, we have a concept called civic amenity sites that the government allots for such purposes. They need to allot more civic amenity sites and larger sites for such public institutions for arts, culture, conversations and the like. There is some level of that happening, but there's scope to do a lot more. Another area where the government can actually pitch in is by bringing fresh land to the table. To take an example that is actually very current in a local context, we have the new government electrical factory, NGF as it's called. That land is not being used now for many, many years, and that is government land.
Okay.
Now, government in its imagination must think in terms of making that as a public space and bring that as a public space for the city, rather than reimagining that space as something that can be monetized for another set of concrete structures. So when such spaces become available, the repurpose needs to be for the public purpose. And that way, that 4% number that I mentioned earlier has a chance to even go up to 15-20% over a period of time. So that's the second thing that government can do, which is really bring some of its unused land for public purposes. The third area that government can play a role, and this also refers to the central government, is the way you do the income tax and the tax treatment of the non-profit institutions. Non-profit institutions can be a trust, a society, or a Section 8 company. But if you really look at some of the income tax provisions, now, if these institutions have to be sustainable, they need rental income, which should be possible to get in terms of renting the premises out for similar purposes to others, and consequently meeting the costs of running such a premises. But currently, the tax laws are not very clear on that, whether that income can be treated as something which is not an income as a profit income, but as something which is for sustainability. But currently the income tax law says not more than 20% of your income can come as other income. But for many of these institutions to survive, renting the place to others is the main source of income to survive. And consequently, the laws need to be changed to recognize that that is not an income for profit, but an income for sustainability. So that's what I mean by playing an enabling role to allow such institutions to survive and even flourish.
Thank you for mentioning that in particular, Ravi, because it's something that I also had to come across and address before having spent the last decade in the nonprofit space. This idea, apparently the history of this 20% rule, and I'm happy we're talking about this on this Pragati podcast, which focuses on policy, is that for non-profits, I think the traditional evolution came from the idea of charitable hospitals. And apparently the precedent has been set by, imagine a charitable hospital which has a functional pharmacy. Now that pharmacy will be a for-profit machine within that larger charitable hospital. And of course, that pharmacy cannot be more than 20% of the overall hospital activities. So this weird rule that 20% of the receipts in any year can come from, such commercial income is such a bizarre and anachronistic thing, which we just need to get rid of from our books, right? And we talk about the ease of doing business, but the ease of doing charitable activities is actually much, much, much worse.
I couldn't agree more. In fact, it is very, very difficult to operate. It's interesting you mentioned that it has its roots in the charitable hospital and pharmacy. I did not know that. So that's useful information. The key thing here really is if the fix is quite simple at one level, the language that needs to be used is really that the net income as opposed to the word, because it gives a sense of gross income. And these activities need to be seen as activities that are necessary to support and make the institution sustainable. And I think it is legitimate, I would say, to put a condition that the use of the premises must be for purposes similar to the institution.
Right.
And therefore there's a related, so I cannot use the institution which is, let's say, given for arts and culture to be run as a Kalyana Mandapam.
Right.
That would be other income for sure.
Absolutely.
But if I use the same thing as a rental thing for other theater and let's say other workshops, education, seminars and the like, they are a related purpose. So even if that distinction is made, it will go a long way to help such institutions be more sustainable.
Adding to all of this, Ravi, do you think another missing role in government where it can stay two steps apart but still play a big role is the missing nature of public universities at the heart of our cities? If we had vibrant universities that were embedded into the heart of the city, wouldn't they also naturally provide not just spaces but also programming in terms of talks and events? There was a time when Central College was a big part of the intellectual heart of Bangalore, right? Unfortunately, today it isn't. So do you think that's another place where governments can reimagine their role?
Most certainly. In fact, you mentioned Central College as an example and these universities. Even those places, what's really happened to a lot of the educational institutions, they tend to see themselves as catering to their audience segment, which is either their students and their ecosystem.
Right.
I think they also can reimagine their role as being part of the larger public ecosystem.
Right.
And even if they started saying 1 day in a week or 2 days in a week or certain kinds of programs will really be thrown open and imagined for the city, then we suddenly find that there are a lot of places that can be brought to the table, because places which have traditionally been looking inward looking in terms of their own audiences, internal, suddenly start taking a larger public worldview of their residence existence.
Certainly. And now let me talk about the private role, right? So again, private colleges and private universities also have the same role. But beyond that, us as individuals and the elite in the city, what has been your experience so far in trying to attract people to invest in ideas like, say, the Bangalore Literature Festival and the Bangalore International Centre? What has the challenge and the journey been like?
In fact, I have a self-described moniker, which is the patron saint of lost causes or the patron saint of very difficult causes. So going around with a begging bowl and a hat is second nature to me. I have no problem going and asking people for cause money, because the view one takes is one never had their money in the first place and nothing ventured, nothing gained. So might as well ask and see if it leads to anything for the cause. But when one has met with people, and there have been people who have been forthcoming and have opened the purse strings, and that's why places like Bangalore International Centre, Ravichandar and the others have become possible. It's because people have contributed. So that we need to realize that people are giving. But it is a difficult sell. It is not something that automatically people are dying to give money to. Because invariably, one of the things that you face when you go and approach people for this, we are told, and it is true, that India is a country with a lot of problems. There are problems of abject poverty. There are problems of education and healthcare. And these are causes for which a lot of people do a lot of their money allocation towards causes of poverty elevation, education, health. These are the more popular ones for which the money goes, including the 2% CSR. Now, in this environment, one has to try and make the case why arts and culture also needs funding, if not at the same level, at least requires some degree of funding. And that's really the difficult part. It is not automatically that people get it as to they need to fund there. They say that this can happen after the other thing is fixed. And then one makes the point that this is not something which is sequential. We need to move on multiple fronts at the same time. And any amount of money that you're willing to give towards arts and culture will be a boon and bonanza. Then you make the case in terms of the employment potential of the arts and culture field in terms of creative artists and the people that the industry supports at the secondary and tertiary level. It's a reasonably large set of people who get supported by this. It plays a role in tourism in the context of states and cities and the like. So you got to address the point of fundraising from multiple angles, but it has to be that this also needs attention in addition to the other worthy causes which definitely need attention.
This was a part of imagination of at least people like the Tatas even a century ago, right? And if we are talking about poverty and malnutrition and all the various challenges in India, they were 100-fold more 100 years ago. And if back then people had the forethought and the wisdom to invest in institutions that are paying a dividend to this day, do you see that thinking coming again, that people want to invest in institutions in India in the 21st century that can take us to the 22nd?
So, for example, the Tatas were clearly forerunners in this place. And in fact, NCPA in Bombay is an example of an institution that's done. I mean, there are lots of other supporters, but I think the Tata Trust played a very big role in an institution like NCPA.
This is the National Centre for the Performing Arts
in Bombay, and I think that's the only center in the country which can support a full-scale opera, orchestra kind of stage. I think it's the only one of its kind in the country. So the Tatas clearly, were front runners in this by a long mile. But what one is seeing right now with this new generation of entrepreneurs and wealth creators that is happening, they are ready to engage in those kind of conversations. So, for example, if you take the Nilekani Philanthropies or the Azim Premji Foundation or the Nadar Foundation, they are doing a lot of work in this kind of space in terms of for arts and culture, etc. So, to answer your question, yes, I think there are definitely green shoots of hope that there's a new generation of philanthropists and foundations which are seeing value in supporting arts, culture, and institutions that foster discussion and conversations. And that's a heartening sign for sure. But that said, fundraising is still quite a difficult ask, because really at the end of the day, we also have to realize that we are all competing for that same pot of resources which goes into causes. And if arts and culture are to flourish, it will require increasingly more enlightened people to engage with the subject and see what role does the soft infrastructure play in the overall society and the way society develops. Now, for example, you have a world which is increasingly getting polarized. My case really is these kind of institutions are the kind of institutions which can become really safe spaces for a neutral platform which is inherently inclusive in its outlook and allows multiple viewpoints to be expressed and discussed in a manner which is really, it's sad that one has to say, but in a civilized debate manner, so that people can listen to alternate viewpoints and make up their mind as to where does the truth lie, etc., We need spaces like this. And institutions like this actually help foster this kind of conversation as we go forward.
Thank you, Ravi. I have several small tangential follow-ups on that. One, in terms of the mechanics of fundraising and so on, is there extra challenges when you go asking for money for physical infrastructure? Is it easier for people to say fund a program than actually give you the core funds needed to, build, say, the Bangalore International Centre or some of the facilities that can enable a lot of the programming that can come later?
That is right. In fact, my experience really has been that people are more comfortable funding programs, and then they see the program happening and they say, okay, my money got used in that sense, which is fine by me. There are foundations and institutions which say that we do not fund hard infrastructure like a building, for example.
Right.
And but even in such cases, when we have made the case that sans the building and own premises, it is not possible to have programming for decades to come, the same institutions which actually had a philosophy of not funding brick and mortar stuff agreed and saw the point of view that sans the building, the next stage does not happen. So the way I see it really is there are people who think in terms of I will not support buildings, I will only support programs. But my own personal experience is if you make the case as to why these buildings are required and one shows the track record and credibility of being able to deliver on the final promise, which is running the programs in those spaces, then people are forthcoming. Because they also, for example, I'll also just, it might be pertinent to mention, Pavan, here, that, for example, such donors will ask you questions on how will you sustain the operations on a month-to-month basis. I don't want you to come back to me for more money to run the place. So once you are able to demonstrate that this is your model for sustainability, then they are more forthcoming to fund the basic building.
So here, Ravi, I want to really understand. I mean, so you have been involved with the Bangalore International Centre. Of course, it's been around for quite a while now. When I visit Delhi, I'm a little envious of some of their slightly larger amounts of such public spaces and infrastructure, right? There's the India International Centre as perhaps a model. I'm also very curious about something like the India Habitat Centre, right? Which is this large space with a lot of working space, event space, public fora, and more. Anything from your journey where you've learned lessons on how these came about and what lessons we can have for Bangalore, for Chennai, for Hyderabad, and for elsewhere in creating some intellectual public spaces of this sort?
See, Delhi has been very fortunate. One, partly because I think government being a very, very large landowner and going back decades, particularly if you go back to something like the India International Centre, they allotted large tracts of land in the first place, which made many subsequent things possible. Similarly, the India Habitat Centre is a reasonably large acreage where those multiple institutions are housed. So that's the land part of it. So that luxury most other places don't seem to have. Most other cities don't seem to have that luxury of land.
Right.
But now when it comes to the programming, clearly with the India International Centre, which came about 4 or 5 decades ago, and I was told that they were actually inspired by something, a similar institution in Japan. One of the founders told me that a similar institution in Japan was their trigger to set up the India International Centre. But subsequently, you see India International Centre, based on that model, 4 more have come up. There is the Goa International Centre, Bangalore International Centre, Pune International Centre, and now the Chennai International Centre. And I'm aware of 2 or 3 other cities which are looking at that model to see how they can craft an international center. I mean, Hyderabad is looking at something, Cochin is looking at something. So one will have to see how it pans out. But clearly, it has helped catalyze similar kinds of institutions.
So here, do you see that City Connect being something that can enable the mobilization of interest and of resources that people who have the resources today are willing to say that, okay, I will invest not just in an institution, but an institution that is connected to my city. So because it is the Bangalore International Centre, does it get more cachet?
Yes, these kind of institutions, while they could be national and global in outlook, they are finally rooted in the local milieu. So there is definitely, you will find Chennai business people coming forward to support the Chennai International Centre, Bangalore business corporates as well as philanthropists coming forward to support the Bangalore International Centre, because there's a certain amount of wanting to give back to where they are located. So to that extent, you would be able to raise money more from the local patrons than from outside. But the institution in its operation tends to have an outlook, or at least when you see the examples around, the outlook is more, I would say, regional, national, and global in the way what the purpose of the institution, apart from obviously catering to the local citizens. And the City Connect that you mentioned is an important element, which means really the idea of City Connect is how can our local corporates and HNIs in a city get connected to the larger idea of the city, which is beyond themselves and their own firms and their own self-interest. How can they give back or invest in the city as a whole, working for all citizens? And that could be whether in terms of helping fund thinking on how to build a better road or how to make such institutions possible.
Thanks, Ravi. So that comes back to this idea of how some of these institutions are very city-oriented and not just general. Right? And here, I have a couple of things to sort of round up the discussion. One is that right now, many of these efforts and institutions and, festivals and so on can still come across as fairly elite, right? I mean, they're meant for people like us, like people who might listen to this podcast, but not necessarily very accessible or friendly to people from all walks of life, especially those very different from our own. But is that the necessary journey? How do we make this such that anyone from any background can have access in a meaningful way?
So I call this the north by northwest. So we need to get north in terms of that's the direction where all these kind of public spaces are truly public and inclusive, such that anybody from any strata of society can partake in what happens in this place. That's the final goal. Now, some of these institutions, you're right in a certain sense, they're definitely perceived as being a little more elitist and for people who reasonably well-to-do, etc. And which is why these institutions have to make an extra effort to do the necessary outreach and be inclusive in the fullest sense of the term. For instance, if I take the Bangalore International Centre, all our events, even though they're enabled by members as well as donors, all our events are free and anybody, member and non-member, can attend. So technically it is open to anybody. But still people may feel intimidated to come into this particular environment, and that is something that one needs to work on. So you need to be able to work, and inclusiveness means many things to many people. And that is another journey in terms of how can the institution be inclusive such that this can be accessed by everybody in terms of, so even if you talk about something like disabilities, how to make it access friendly, hearing impaired friendly, etc. All these are demands and very legitimate demands. And they are not easy to fix overnight, but one needs to work on it. Similarly, for example, institutions, because I've been using Rangshankara as an example, for the longest time, Rangshankara capped the ticket price for its events at 200 rupees. I mean, BIC is free because it's a different model. Rangshankara said that no ticket will be charged more than 200 rupees. So different institutions are approaching this issue because at the end of the day, none of us who have been involved in putting together such spaces want it to be restricted. We want to reach out to as many people as possible. Often it's not possible because of budgetary constraints and other constraints to make this possible overnight. But the journey and the direction, I feel, should be in that direction. I mean, we really need to figure out how to make all these places truly inclusive in every sense of the term. And if that broad in principle commitment is there, while it might take time, I'm very optimistic that we will get there.
Thank you, Ravi. And I couldn't agree more. So my final question for our discussion today is that right now we are living online lives. I'm working with you with the Bangalore International Centre, we're doing online programming, but this online world will not last in its entirety to forever, right? I mean, some point we will want to go back and mingle and, be physically present to attend events and more. So do you see the value of the social infrastructure in our cities going up in a world which is post this pandemic?
Yes. In fact, I have a feeling, and this is just a hypothesis, that when this pandemic is behind us, things like these kind of public spaces and going out for a play or a dance performance or a movie or a discussion, whatever, these are things that people have missed in a big way during the months of the pandemic. So my own hypothesis is the desire to spend time in such spaces will actually increase once this threat is gone. I mean, as long as the threat is there, people will gingerly step out even as these spaces open up. They are not going to overnight throng to them. But once the threat is gone, I would think that people will see the value in these kind of physical public spaces and will want to consume more activities in such spaces. That's my construct. But that said, I also see the future as being hybrid, because even institutions like ourselves have realized that there is an audience you can reach which is beyond just the physical space. At the end of the day, an auditorium might be 180, 200, or 500 people. But today, what we have seen in the virtual world, you can actually reach out to the world with that same offering, albeit the experience may not be exactly the same as being inside that room. So I see a hybrid model evolving over time, which will be a mix of these physical spaces as well as the virtual. But the desire to be in such physical spaces, I suspect will increase, especially with the threat that there could be future pandemics, which again drive us indoors. People will want to consume more of it when this threat is gone. That's my, let me put it this, that's my wish. I hope that we are all able to get back and enjoy these kind of public spaces, and more people come forward to create more public institutions like these, so that there is more going around, because the amount of such institutions that we have got is pathetically low at this point of time. They need to quintuple or go up 10x from what we have currently.
So we should perhaps be now thinking of this not at the city level, but also at the area level or the locality level, right? I mean, perhaps we need a Koramangala International Centre and a Basangudi International Centre, and not just the Bangalore International Centre.
That is right. Actually, hyper-local, as they call it. And I believe in the 3-kilometer city. You need to live and work and have your social infrastructure all within 3 kilometers so that you can walk and cycle to all these places. So if I extend that logic to what you said, Pavan, ideally, the scale need not be of the same scale as a city-level facility, but clearly there's a case for more of such institutions to develop locally within a city, so that people can walk across and be part of such activities in their own localities.
Ravi, thank you so much for coming back on Pragati Podcast and talking to me about all of this. It's an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Pavan. Thank you so much for having me.
Dear listener, thank you for tuning in. The Pragati Podcast is made possible thanks to the support of the Takshashila Institution and IPSMF, the Independent Public-Spirited Media Foundation. And if you're listening to this episode on your favorite podcast app and want to learn more about some of what we discussed, do head over to tiny.cc/Pragati149 to check out the in-audio links, references, images, and more. And dear listener, I know that in this episode we talked quite a bit about Bangalore and gave examples from this city where both Ravichandar and I have been living in for a long time. Do tell us about what institutions make your city come to life, and what makes your life in your city much richer. Thank you so much. Thank you for staying with us till the end. If you have any questions or comments, do write in to podcast@thinkpragati.com. And hey, if you like the podcast and listen to us on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. It'll mean a lot to us. The Pragati Podcast is available on the IVM Podcast app and pretty much every other podcast app and platform. We are there everywhere.
नमस्ते, मैं हूँ सौरभ चंद्रा
और मैं प्रणय कोटस्ताने।
जब महफिल खत्म होते होते दरवाजे के बाहर पुलिया के ऊपर हम दुनिया भर की जटिल समस्याओं को सॉल्व करने में लग जाते हैं तो हो जाती है पुलियाबाजी।
अब आजकल के अपार्टमेंट वालों ने तो कभी पुलिया देखी नहीं होगी, पर आप फीलिंग तो समझ ही सकते हैं।
तो आइए शामिल हो जाइए हमारी पुलियाबाजी में, जहां प्रणय और मैं एक से एक इंटरेस्टिंग टॉपिक्स की तह तक जाएंगे।
आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंस, बिटकॉइन, पाकिस्तान, मेडिकल एजुकेशन, करेंसी क्राइसिस, कभी हम दोनों के साथ और अक्सर स्पेशल एक्सपर्ट गेस्ट की कंपनी में।
सुनिए हमें IVM की वेबसाइट, ऐप या अपने फेवरेट पॉडकास्टिंग प्लेटफॉर्म पर हर दूसरे हफ्ते।
Have you ever wondered how successful people do their thing? How do they navigate the challenges they often face? Are you wondering about the future of restaurants, film, education, technology, and everything else in between? Hi, I'm Gauri Devidyal, best known for being one of the brains behind The Table, an award-winning restaurant in Bombay. One thing my life as a restaurateur has given me is the opportunity to meet with some truly inspiring people. Most often just by chatting with strangers at the community table. And that's what this podcast is about. It's about learning the new dimensions of business and understanding how different people swim this sea. It's an opportunity for me to pick their brains and ask them all the questions on my mind, whether it's about learning from their past experiences or talking about future trends. Through their journeys, stories, and insights, I hope you too, like me, will come away inspired and energized. So come, join me every Wednesday with your favorite drink, because this round is on me.